Subscribe to The Honest Critique for current affairs, movie, book, and product reviews. Also, make sure you press the bell icon to get notified whenever we upload a new video. The views, information, or opinions expressed during the video series are solely those of the individuals and do not necessarily represent those of The Honest Critique and its employees. The following video contains strong language which may be offensive to some viewers. Viewer discretion advised.
So, hello and welcome to a very special episode we are recording today. I'm delighted to be joined by Phil Gurski, who was a senior strategic analyst at the Canadian Security Intelligence Services. So, thank you so much, Phil, for taking your time and speaking to us.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
So, Phil, we had a conversation on exactly kind of a year back about when this case broke out, and not much progress that we have seen, especially in terms of what we have in the public domain. So I wanted to start a little bit about Prime Minister Trudeau's statement. He came out recently again with the same allegation, but this time around, when there was a hearing, especially on the foreign interference, he said that there are serious allegations based on intelligence, but he has said that he hasn't provided any hard evidence with India. So how credible is it to make such a serious allegation without actually providing any backing in the first place to India at this point of time?
It's curious to me that he said that, because it's my understanding, and again, this is based on open information, that Canadian officials did travel to India with the information that they had, meaning intelligence, and provided that intelligence to their senior counterparts within India, within the intelligence community. So it looks to me like at least some members within the Canadian government have in fact given India the intelligence that it was in its possession and asked India to explain, its version of things. So I think that information has been shared with the Indian government.
But on the retrospective, if we look at it, the way it played out publicly, you have been in intelligence for long enough. Does this happen quite a while in your profession that we see an open allegation out there in the public for a year and not much happening around it?
Look, it's not hard to understand that the Prime Minister has been under quite a bit of criticism in the last couple of years because of a failure to act on intelligence, especially with respect to foreign interference. The inquiry referred to has been in action for quite some time. We're speaking largely about interference by the People's Republic of China in elections in Canada, intelligence that has been collected and reported to the government for more than 25 years now, not just this government, but several governments. And there has been some speculation the government didn't use the intelligence, didn't read the intelligence, or didn't believe the intelligence. So that the Prime Minister, I think, for a lot of Canadians are asking the question, why didn't you read the intelligence? Why didn't you think it was important? And so in this case, it's rather interesting to note that a government that ignored intelligence on China for a very, very long time seems to now be saying, well, we have this great intelligence on alleged Indian involvement in the assassination of a Canadian citizen. And now we're going to believe that intelligence, and we're going to put that intelligence out in the public domain. Secondly, not surprisingly, as someone who worked in this intelligence as long as I did, you don't want your leaders to tell anybody in the public what kind of intelligence you have. You could compromise sources, you could compromise methods. And so I think a lot of us who worked in the industry were surprised at the level of detail that was disclosed in public, because it could have a negative effect on our operations.
And I want to take it a little forward, Phil, because it's interesting that when the Prime Minister came out with the allegation, he directly named the Indian ambassador. I don't remember something happening like this quite a while in the history there, that a foreign country, an ambassador has been named as one of the subject, and that actually led to a huge escalation between the two countries. Actually, so could you tell was that a correct way to approach it, even if, let's say, the ambassador was involved? to name him directly, especially if, from your experience, have you seen how the Khalistanis have targeted the diplomatic staff in Canada?
Yeah, right. It's hard for me to speculate as to why he elected to name High Commissioner Verma here in Canada. I can only draw the conclusion, again, based on what's available in the public domain, that the RCMP, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, has done an investigation into this since the killing of Najjar, because there were national security implications, and that's completely regular here in Canada. I mean, normally a murder would be handled by local police, municipal police, for example, in this case in British Columbia on the west coast of Canada. But given the possible political nature of this killing, the RCMP is the police force of jurisdiction. The RCMP did provide the findings of its investigation to the government. The RCMP commissioner also made a public statement. And I can only assume that the RCMP found out information, i.e. evidence, that linked members of the Indian High Commission here in Ottawa, in Canada, to the killing of Najjar, and that based on that information that was provided to the Prime Minister and his cabinet, his staff, that the Prime Minister felt that this was appropriate to publicly name the High Commissioner and other members of the Indian High Commission in Canada as, I think the wording that was said was that some level of involvement in the killing of Mr. Najjar. I don't think they said the High Commissioner killed him. They said the High Commission had a role, some kind of a role in arranging this particular act. And what we're being led to believe now is that there was some kind of a deal or contract between Indian diplomats and or intelligence agents and organized crime figures, whether they be here in India or in Canada. You're right, it is an extraordinary move to make, but again, I can only assume that move was made because the evidence that's been gathered to date in the course of this investigation was seen to be credible, solid evidence.
And you have also experience working with the RCMP, and I wanted to ask you one more question about that. That what the Indian side has been accusing the Trudeau government is that he is trying to play a political move because of an incoming election, and what he has seen over the past few years, especially with the support base that he has garnered with the Khalistani extremists, he is trying to actually appease them. And that's the reason he has publicly come about and is making a strong point on the Indian side, especially when we have seen there have been credible intelligence of Chinese interference as well. So is that one of the reasons why we have seen the RCMP coming out and giving a press conference, especially because Trudeau had the first word out in public?
Okay, you asked very good questions. And obviously I can only speculate because I'm no longer on the inside. So fact number one, the Prime Minister is very unpopular. Opinion polls show that regularly, to the point now where even some Liberal members of Parliament are asking the Prime Minister to step down. He is the leader of a minority government. He just lost the support of one of his key coalition partners, the New Democratic Party, or NDP, which is led, interestingly, by a Sikh Canadian. So that the government needs a good news story right now because Canadians are very much ready for a change. We've had this government in power for 9 years, and Canadians simply want a new government. Like any governments, they run their course, and it's time for a change. That's just the nature of democracy. You also refer to the Sikh community, and there's no question that in certain ridings, which what we call electoral districts here in Canada, the Sikh diaspora has a very large influence. This is in parts of British Columbia on the west coast, as well as in ridings in the northern part of Toronto. Look at all politics, everything prime ministers do is political at some level. And for a prime minister who is not very popular, whom a lot of Canadians would like to see leave office, any way that he can deflect that criticism by pointing to another issue is something that's what politicians do. Canadian, Indian, American, it doesn't really matter. The other point I think that bears out here, and I'm going to be very careful with this, Sikh extremism never went away. As your listeners may be aware, the single greatest act of terrorism in aviation history prior to 9/11 was the bombing of Air India Flight 125 back in 1985. That attack was planned and executed by Canadian Sikh extremists here in Canada. Okay. Now, Sikh terrorism as an issue has sort of fallen off the radar here in Canada over the past, I'd say, 35 years, since the early 1990s. But as somebody who has studied terrorism and worked in counterterrorism as long as I have, I hold to the theory that terrorist groups never really go away unless they achieve their goals, at which point they become the government. Like, I think the African National Congress is an excellent example. They were a terrorist group under apartheid Africa. They became the power, and now no one calls the ANC a terrorist group anymore. I don't know what level of threat Sikh terrorism plays within India itself, but I do know that there is a certain percentage of the population. So the Sikh population in Canada is estimated at 770,000 people. There are undoubtedly a number of people within that diaspora who still want an independent Khalistan in the Punjab, and an even smaller percentage of people who think that violence is the only way to achieve that goal. Again, I have no figures that I can provide with you to say how large the problem is, but I would be very, very surprised if, in fact, the possibility that there are those who would justify the use of violence, which is what terrorism is, to achieve a political goal was zero. In fact, I can almost guarantee you it's not zero. How big it is, again, I don't know. But going back to your earlier point, I mean, this has become a political issue. None of this excuses the reality that if, in fact, Indian intelligence and or politicians had a role in the assassination of Mr. Najjar, that's inexcusable and needs to be identified and punished. But at the same time, I think India has a valid point to make in that Canada seems to be ignoring Sikh extremism, on our soil. I would assume India has passed intelligence on to Canada in that regard. Again, I don't know. I'm only speculating. And if it felt that Canada was not paying any attention to that intelligence, there would be a level of frustration on the part of India as well. But I also must caveat my remarks. As I said earlier, I'm not exactly certain how great the violent Khalistani movement is within India. I try to read Indian media. I don't see a lot of reporting on it in Indian media. It's basically a non-issue here in Canada. It has been for the past many years. But I guess sorry, it's a very long answer to your question, but I think there are a lot of moving parts on this issue. There's the Prime Minister's popularity. There's a criticism over a lack of ability to follow intelligence. There's an expectation that the people who killed Mr. Najjar will be found and brought to justice. There's bilateral relations between India and Canada. There's India's place in the world as a rising global power. As a side note, I'll just mention, I just read 5 minutes ago that the United States had charged a former Indian intelligence officer in relation to an assassination plot in their country, which suggests to me that there is a possibility that this is going on. I think we should recognize that, obviously somebody killed Mr. Najjar and somebody planned to kill a Sikh activist on US soil. Who that person was, what links they had, that's all to be determined. But I think we have to be open to the possibility that India may have grown so frustrated with Canadian inaction when it respect to Sikh extremism that they decided to adopt an alternative way of dealing with this.
Let me ask you a different question. Since you mentioned about the US case, which is another one of the things that India has been dealing with the leader for Sikh for Justice, while US say that they are satisfied with the cooperation that has been going on with the case with India, why does the Canadian counterparts not say the exact same thing? Why do you think that the Indians are cooperating with the US on one side, but not cooperating with Canada on the other side?
Okay. So as I said earlier, my understanding is that there have been very high-level visits by Canadian officials, including intelligence officials and their Indian counterparts in the past. And as you said, there doesn't seem to be a level of cooperation between India and Canada as there is between India and the United States. And here's where I'm going to be very frank with you. I don't think Canada matters to India in the same way the United States matters to India. I don't think the Indian government views Canada as critical a partner as they view the United States as a critical partner. And this is one thing that certainly has been true over the past, I'd say, 10 years or so, where Canada's standing internationally amongst its partners, its allies, has suffered because of the policies of the current government. A lot of mistakes have been made, and I don't think Canada's taken this seriously. So I don't think, on one level, India is going to put a lot of effort into its relations with Canada, whereas it would put a lot of effort into its relations with the United States, because it can't afford to lose that relationship. I think that India may have, and again, this is purely speculation on my part, I think India has made the decision that it can afford not to, it can afford, Canada, India doesn't need Canada like India needs the United States. And that may enter into the calculus as to why they've decided to cooperate more fully with the Americans and less so with their Canadian counterparts.
And I have a couple of more questions, and I will ask you. One of them is one thing that, again, the government here, and mostly, if not the government, at least the people out here in India pointing at, is the same thing that we have been discussing, that probably Canada is not paying attention to. One of the things that India has been talking about a lot is the possibility of Sikh extremism. And we've seen that in the Foreign Interference Committee hearing, that the Prime Minister chooses to bring someone for testifying who is actually been designated as a terrorist in India, the Sikh for Justice leader, who has openly called for attacking the Indian diplomats. So was that a very, a sensible way of dealing with the issue, especially when Indians have been pointing out their own shared problem with the movement?
Well, to me, the bottom line is I wasn't aware of that. If that's true, this is a government that has been woefully inadequate when it comes to acting on the intelligence it has. We had an incident several years ago where a former Ukrainian Nazi was honored in Parliament, a very embarrassing moment for the government of the day. As I said earlier, we have to understand there's politics and there's intelligence. And politicians play the political game when they see fit to play the political game. As a former intelligence analyst, I'm disappointed when intelligence is not used and it's not listened to. And so if this individual in question was in fact identified as somebody who had espoused violence in favor of the Khalistani cause, then no, that's not appropriate for that person to have any role in any kind of inquiries. Again, I don't have the details on this individual. I don't know to what extent he or she has in fact been identified with that particular connection, but it has happened in the past, and it certainly is possible that individuals whose connections are not consistent with what we want to promote here in a Canadian democracy should not be part of those proceedings.
I'm asking you this because in that same testimony, he specifically used the word that he has been in contact with the Prime Minister's office for the last 2-3 years. And this brings to the entire conversation that, especially the government of India, and I want to ask you a broader question, and this will be my last question, that the Canadian government, for example, has suggested a gang member's involvement in the assassination attempt of Hardeep Singh Nijjar, where India has highlighted yesterday itself that they have made at least 20 plus extradition requests to Canada for the same gang members, and they have actually pinpointed the location as well where they're located. And the Indian government is saying that it's Canadian government's inability to even extradite those members and now say that those gang members are responsible for the killing of Nijjar. So could you talk a little bit about that?
It's hard for me to comment on that because I'm not a specialist in extradition. I do know that countries can put formal requests to each other to extradite people who do pose a threat to them, whether they be terrorists or criminals. Why the Canadian government would not honor those extradition requests, I don't know. I do know that in other instances, Canada would elect not to act on a request if they had reasonable grounds to believe that the person may be mistreated if they were returned to their homelands. I worked on several cases like that of people who probably had terrorism ties, and we chose not to send them back to their home countries because we believe they might be tortured, for example. I don't know that to be the case here. I am going to, again, it's pure speculation on my point. I'm going to assume that every extradition request carefully by the Canadian side, the nature of the request, the information sent to support the extradition request is analyzed and is judged whether it is significant and sufficient enough to warrant the extradition of somebody to a foreign country. But the end of the day, the reasons why the government would choose not to extradite, I have no insight on that whatsoever. So I can't go any further because I simply don't have any information to answer that question.
So before I let you go, Phil, this has been one of the conversations which we had with multiple, people from Canada, especially because we have a large diaspora there who are actually studying in Canada. How does this impact this sudden escalation between the two countries, especially that's been happening for the last 1 year? And now there's been expulsion of diplomats from both sides and downgrading of diplomatic statuses. How do you see that?
It's not good. As you say, there are a large number of Indian nationals here in Canada, both Sikhs and Hindus, who study, work, live in Canada. It's part of a larger issue, though. There's a lot of debate now on foreign students here in Canada. Do we have too many foreign students? There are allegations that are the fact that the immigration rate has increased significantly under this government has led to higher housing costs, less availability of rental units for people, et cetera, et cetera. So this is all wrapped up with the immigration debate here in Canada. Universities are pushing back, saying we rely on foreign students, largely because the tuition they pay is much greater than the tuition that Canadians pay. So this is part of a larger argument as to, what do we want Canada to look like? What levels of immigration? And for the record, Canada is a very pro-immigrant country, always has been. But there's been some concern that the immigration rate has been too high over the last 10 years and needs to be scaled back a bit. The counter argument is that Canada is not growing naturally in the sense that, Canadian families aren't as big as they used to be. Therefore, we need immigration to feed our economic engine. And there's certainly some validity to those arguments. But when you have issues like this, like the expulsion of diplomats on both sides, obviously it hampers diplomatic relations between the two countries. And there'll have to be a lot of sort of mending of fences, I think. Where this whole thing goes, I really have no idea. But yes, it is having an effect on the diasporas. Not to mention, probably, and again, speculatively on my part, although I have seen some news reporting on this, probably some fear or misunderstanding within the diaspora. So like I say, we have a very large Sikh diaspora here in Canada. We have a large Indian diaspora as well. And the two are not necessarily mutually exclusive, but there are some differences. And there probably have been some concerns that what's happening right now might lead to some misunderstandings amongst those various diasporas here in Canada.
Well, that's all the question that I had, Phil. So thank you so much for taking time and speaking.
My pleasure. It's always nice to talk to you.
Thank you so much.